For tonight's program, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Chantel White. Chantel is an expert in archaeobotany, or the recovery and analysis of plant remains of all types. She has a Ph.D. in archaeology from Boston University, and before coming to Penn, she taught at the University of Notre Dame until we snagged her in 2015. At Penn, she is a teaching specialist in archaeobotany at CAAM, and in 2021, she was promoted to senior lecturer. Chantel teaches courses not just in archaeobotany, but also co-teaches other CAAM courses such as Living World in archaeological science and others. She's mentored many undergraduate and graduate students in their research, and she's collaborated on exhibits in the Penn Museum, including the current exhibit, Ancient Food and Flavor. Her research is mainly in Greece, Israel, Jordan, but also here in Philadelphia, in Charleston, South Carolina, and elsewhere in the United States. This evening, Chantel will tell us about her research at two ancient Greek sites and show how scientific techniques used in Penn Museum's CAAM labs help bring the foods of classical Greece into sharper focus. Now, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A area and chat area, and they will be read to our speaker after the program. And so now let's hear from Chantel with her presentation, which is entitled Daily Fare and Sacred Offerings in Classical Greece. Chantel, take it away, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see everything. I'm just going to assume yes.
It looks great.
Okay, good. Things have gone awry before, so it's good to be sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Chantel. I'm going to be talking about archaeobotanical work that I've carried out in Greece, specifically in classical Greek excavations with my students over the past several years. And we're going to be focusing on residential sites. And then I'm also going to talk about another site where work has been done to understand foods that were part of ritual dining deposits at Acrocorinth in southern Greece. So to put this in a little bit of context, I carry out fieldwork almost every summer with my students as part of this program that I created. It's called the Summer Archaeobotany Program. And I take somewhere between 2 and 4 students with me almost every summer, I think for maybe the past 7 or 8 summers, except for COVID, to Greece, but to other sites too, including sites in Israel and Jordan. And it's meant to complement the courses that I teach in CAAM. So the courses I teach, which are archaeobotany focused, that is the study of plant foods and other plant materials that are preserved in the archaeological record. Right, there's only so much you can teach in a classroom, and there's only so much you can show in a laboratory setting. But really, it's important for students to go out into the field. And for something that's as sciencey as archaeobotany, it's really good for people who are interested in that to get to experience the field, to participate in archaeological digs, and to understand how we collect these samples, how we process them, and then eventually how it leads to the analysis and interpretation of the results. So what I'm going to be talking about is basically what I also try to teach my students, which is how to place these results then in a larger context of understanding what foods were being eaten and what things we can know or still have yet to know about both daily meals and offerings. So this is a photo from this past summer from 2023. We were excavating a temple and processing samples from a temple. And it was just a beautiful day where the sun was shining through the clouds. And it was just, lovely to be out, in the field in the summertime excavating. So some of the research questions that I'm going to try to answer during this presentation is first and foremost sort of the technique and methodology. So how is food evidence preserved over time? So that's how do things even survive at archaeological sites that are organic, like plant foods? How are these foods then recovered by archaeologists what are the techniques that we use to actually extract these foods from the soils. Then how can we identify ingredients, sort of like individual ingredients, right? Say different crops, as well as evidence for cooking and baking of foods. That is like the processing and preparation of creating meals. And then also, what can we learn about these dishes that were being prepared? Who prepared them, how they were prepared, right? These cooking techniques. And then also where these foods were consumed and who consumed them. It's another interesting question too. I'm not a person who's really super interested in feasts and these sort of like, you know, exclusive food consumption parties. I tend to be much more interested in sort of daily life sorts of things and the kinds of people who maybe aren't always recognized in the archaeological record. So you'll see my research kind of skewing towards that. So to start with the first case study, I'm going to be talking about the site of Molivoti. It's also been identified as the ancient site of Strimi, and it's located in northern Greece. And I'm going to be talking about basically these everyday foods and the evidence that we can see for preparation and cooking. At the heart of archaeological studies of food is the investigation of everyday practices, these rhythms and repetitions that constitute daily life. And the preparation and eating of food are not only daily biological necessities, but they offer rich arenas for reinforcing bonds and social relationships, for constructing our social identities, for maintaining culinary traditions, and for exploring new tastes. The material traces of foods and their associated artifacts, like, you know, cooking pots and braziers and fruit bowls and things, allow us to begin to approach what Kathleen Morrison has called the active agentive transformation of materials into sustenance. That is the art of meal making. A consideration of meal making in classical Greece must take note of three important challenges that reflect the complexities of food preparation. First, daily cooking activities were often carried out by enslaved people. The individuals who prepared these meals may have had vastly different cultural identities from the Greek households in which they were enslaved. These enslaved individuals also would have included men, women, and children. We might presume that enslaved people were taught specific recipes and cooking techniques that reflected a Greek or a localized Greek Thracian cuisine in the case of Molivoti, but their unique agency, skill, and reputation as household cooks or as hired chefs for private parties is for the most part unrecognized. Second, the domestic spaces in which daily meals were prepared were fluid, in the sense that in classical Greece, right, cooking hearths were not necessarily permanent installations. So we kind of have to set aside this idea of kitchen, like a home is where the hearth is, and the kitchen is kind of the heart of the home. Like we have to kind of set those things aside when we think about classical Greece. These were not permanent installations. They were very flexible and portable. Scholar Sarah Morris has argued that pot props, such as the one shown here from Molivoti on the left, were used to hold ceramic vessels over a cooking fire. The props were versatile enough that they could accommodate pots of varying sizes, and they were easily transported when needed. Given the impermanence of many classical cooking installations, the archaeological identification of food preparation activities requires basically a multi-pronged approach. So we can study spaces like courtyards where a lot of cooking occurred. We can study particular features like hearths, for example. And we can also study the ceramic finds that are found in these locations too, that might be related to both the production of meals as well as the consumption of meals. And then, of course, the analysis of archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological assemblages. And today, although usually we work in tandem, right? Archaeobotany and zooarchaeology, plant and animal remains. Today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on plant remains, since that's what I study. And then third, we should reconsider our culturally relative definitions of the word meal. As Lynn Foxhall has asserted, daily cooking and eating in classical Greece was not a tightly structured activity. Small amounts were being cooked and served several times a day to different groups within households. It's therefore essential to recognize the importance of what we call tertiary refuse deposits. Basically, that's garbage deposits that have sort of accumulated over time. And they're the sort of thing that nobody wants to think about, right? The accumulation of garbage in an alleyway or in the sort of back of the property or something. But for an archaeologist, those are really, really interesting deposits because they basically show all the different sorts of food remains and things that have been tossed out and discarded and sort of built up over time that reflect daily activities in a particular home or in a particular property or neighborhood. So the contents of these garbage deposits directly reflect the consumption patterns of local residents, the summarized material of many small meals, many snacks, and daily fare. And it's through this lens that we can learn about food practices at the household and neighborhood levels. So I'm going to focus on, for the first part here, on the Molivoti Thrace Archaeological Project. This is a project that I've worked on since 2013, and it's directed by Nathan Arrington, who's a professor at Princeton University, Marina Tasiklaki, and Domina Tertsopoulou, both of whom are in Greece at different ephyrea. And here's where we work at Molivoti, all the way up in the northeastern corner of Greece. You can't go much farther east or much farther north. We're right near the city of Komotini, but we're located on the coast. So on the Molivoti Peninsula, which is right on the coast. Okay, so the Molivoti excavations have focused on two classical residential structures, both of which are laid out on a Hippodamian grid plan. So you can think of city blocks. They're laid out on basically city blocks. And they were both occupied during the early to mid 4th century BC. And we call these two houses the House of Hermes and the House of the Gorgon. And targeted flotation samples were carried out basically from targeting the courtyard floors to maybe pick up any of these cooking activities, drains and well features, hearth installations, and many other loci, including the contents of ceramic vessels. So here you can see the plans of both of these houses. House of Hermes on the left. One of the interesting things about this one is the andron here, so the men's drinking room or men's rumpus room. And then over here, the House of the Gorgon, we see a little bit more of a complicated floor plan. And this is because the site was destroyed. Both these sites were, or both of these houses were destroyed in 375 BC. But the House of the Gorgon was rebuilt. Portions of it were rebuilt and sort of remodeled. And that's what you can see in the blue there, dating to 325 BCE. And then there's this interesting circular feature right in the middle. That's late Roman, so it doesn't have anything to do with really what I'm going to be talking about today. And we're still kind of unclear about what its purpose would have been, whether it was something like a granary, whether it was a threshing floor, whether it was a dovecote. We don't really know. So yeah, we haven't found any indication of what that might have been yet. And then I'm also going to be mentioning this area that's sort of completely separate from the excavations, where we did a little mini excavation. So south of the main excavation area, a large 4th century pit feature associated with a wall or foundation and a mud brick superstructure was identified adjacent to the harbor. So this whole thing is basically being eroded by waves. So this is the harbor here. And then the waves are eroding this sort of outcrop or scarp or bank. And there's archaeological deposits in there. So where this green circle is, there is this very large and very sort of rich looking feature in terms of pottery and in terms of plant and animal remains, where we could actually see what looked to be burned sediments and animal bones and bits of broken pots and things. So over on the right-hand side here, you can see a photo of that feature, but you can already see that the waves have really eroded it. In fact, one whole side of this feature is missing, this side over here. So all we've got is this little wall here, and then there's sort of like a mud brick kind of thing running up here. So we're imagining, and we don't know for sure yet, but we're imagining basically like a pit feature that was dug, a subterranean pit feature that was dug. And in some way, they kind of shored up the base of it with this wall. And then it has these sterile deposits down here. And then it's just full of garbage. And we don't know if maybe it could have been like a cesspit or like a, waste deposit, that kind of thing. But whatever its original purpose was, there were lots and lots of garbage deposits that were thrown in here. And the preservation is so excellent that it's possible that maybe it was like fresh garbage that was kind of thrown down into this pit. And then because it would have stunk so bad, they just consistently lit the pit on fire to kind of keep down the smell until we get this buildup of basically burned material. Not really sure. It's just such a rich deposit, and it hasn't been, it hasn't really been reworked and moved around. So because all this stuff was really protected by this little stone wall, and it was so deep under the modern ground surface, it's really well protected. But these waves crashing into it over and over again have really kind of worked to start destroying this feature. So we also excavated this. So given the substantial amount of damage caused by both recent looting and erosion due to storm waves, this feature was extensively sampled for flotation during the 2019 season. So in total, excavations from the harbor feature and from the houses totaled about 571 liters of classical archaeological sediment that we floated and analyzed. And we collected thousands of macrobotanical specimens. So 571 liters is basically the equivalent of like 57 pretty large buckets. If you just imagine, we went through 57 large buckets of dirt to extract as many plant specimens as we possibly could that were preserved from the 4th century BCE. So before I explain how we did that, I want to explain how this stuff even survives. And when I say survives, I don't mean that it would grow, like that we could plant it and it would grow. I mean that it survives in a form where we can actually just identify what it is. And the way that that happens primarily is through a process called carbonization. It's a lot like burning, except that things aren't burned to a complete crisp. They don't turn into just the gray dust that's at the bottom of your grill or something, where it's just like this fine ash. That's not exactly what I mean. Carbonization is basically this process where, say something like seeds, like wheat grains, for example. Let's say wheat grains, like a porridge or something, accidentally fall into a hearth. Let's say they fall into a cooking hearth, but they don't fall right into the fire. They're basically sort of scattered along the sides of the hearth. What this leads to is high temperatures, but not enough to actually start the grains on fire and to completely destroy them. Instead, they basically just kind of get charred. So they retain their shape and they can still be identified. Maybe they're sort of warped and things. It's not always easy to identify these things, but they still kind of retain their original form enough that we can identify them. So that's what you're looking at on this lower image here on the right-hand side, right? We've got all sorts of different cereal grains here. We've got grape seeds, we've got peas, we've got maybe a flax seed here. We've got a lot of different things going on there that have survived. Looks like pretty high temperatures. They're all kind of just like a little bit warped and charred, and that's why they have that dark appearance to them too. But they've survived and they can be identified. So how does this happen at most archaeological sites then? This is the primary sort of type of preservation that we see on archaeological sites. And the reason is because it's so common. So most people are cooking, right? Most people are cooking meals multiple times a day. So we see cooking hearths, a lot of carbonized plant material showing up in cooking hearths, also in sacrifices and funerary offerings, where there's the element of fire being added and foods are being charred. Then also in accidental fires, if you think about just how many lamps could overturn and how many fires are being used for heating and for cooking, there's a lot of, there's a strong possibility that accidental fires could occur. And then we also see destruction layers at many sites. So where a site is, a village is attacked, for example, and intentional fires are set, and we can oftentimes see like a layer of destruction, which is the case actually at Molivoti around 375 BCE. We do see a destruction layer there as well. Okay, so how do we recover then these carbonized plant remains? One of the techniques that I teach my students, and this is where I go out to all these different archaeological sites, is a technique called flotation. And basically, flotation helps us separate out the dirt from the carbonized plant remains, and we can then sort of extract them using water. And the basic idea is that these plant remains, because they've been charred kind of to a crisp, they're kind of like, they're pretty lightweight. They're actually less dense than water. So if we were to submerge a whole bunch of dirt from an archaeological deposit in water, most of the artifacts would sink, right? So the ceramic pots would sink, the stone tools would sink, coins would sink, animal bones for the most part would sink to the bottom of the bucket, for example. But the plant remains, because they're charred and so lightweight and they're not very dense at all, they actually float to the surface. So we use that principle to sort of extract all these carbonized plant remains from archaeological sediments. So I'll show you what that looks like. This is a flotation tank, kind of the style of flotation tank that I build at a lot of different sites. And they always, I know that it looks a little ramshackle, ask you to reserve judgment on that, because I usually do build them out of garbage cans. And the reason why is because, I can only bring so many materials from Home Depot here in the US, and then at a certain point I need to go to hardware stores in whatever country I'm working in, and it would be very difficult to transport a huge garbage can, right? So I buy whatever is locally available to construct this flotation system. So what I would draw your attention to first is the garbage can that's sitting on top of the chair. That's the main tank. That's the one where we actually do all of the processing of archaeological sediment. And then the second one, the second tank that's sitting on the ground, all that is a water reservoir. So that's where clean water is, and we use a bilge pump, so a hand pump from a boat, which you can see there, to pump that clean water into the main tank. So we kind of recycle the water, but we make sure there's no contamination. So let me show you how that works. Okay, so you can see the woman on the right is pumping water into the main tank. And here's some archaeological sediment, right? Just dirt right from the excavation being dumped in. And then we swirl that water around, and the plant remains will float to the surface of the water. And then you can see there's that little spout with a tiny bag attached. The plant remains will float into that bag. We'll collect that little bag, and then we'll analyze that material. We'll dry it so it's less fragile, and then we'll analyze that material. So most of our plant remains that we get from archaeological excavations come in this form: carbonized plant material that's found in what we call the light fraction, that is the little bag. Okay, but then you can also see, right, that that's not everything. This wouldn't be a very useful system if we lost all the other artifacts, right? Of course, the coin people still want to study the coins. The ceramics people still want to study the ceramics. So that's why we have this window screen. And you can see it's basically laying inside the garbage can like a basket, and it's clipped on the rim of the garbage can. That's to collect all the heavy things. And all those heavy artifacts basically get a good wash. So all the dirt is kind of scrubbed from them, and we get nice clean artifacts, and that's called the heavy fraction. We also take a look at that. So I have one more video to show you of what the floating plant remains look like. So take a look in the water, right? And you can see all these pieces of wood, maybe some little seeds, floating to the surface and sort of being encouraged by a student into the little bag. And then you can see that little bag, the light fraction bag, filling up with plant material. So that's the process of flotation, honestly. So this is what my students and I go to all these different sites and carry out. So here's some photos from Molivoti. You can see a very similar looking flotation tank. And these students smiling, I think probably pretending to have fun. It is actually kind of nice because it gets so hot there to have the water and stuff. It's actually kind of cool. But anyways, collected light fraction and heavy fraction. And then all that stuff has got to be looked at in the lab, right? So here you can see another group of students on the right-hand side. They're using their phones as lights, and they are picking through all of the stuff that's been caught in the window screen that was a basket inside of that flotation tank to pull out anything like beads, coins, any little animal bones, things like fish scales. Think about how fragile a fish scale is. We have many hundreds of fish scales that a student has seen and then pulled out from that window screen. So that takes a lot of time too. So all this gets analyzed and sorted. And then we've got the light fraction, we've got the plant remains to look at too. So one of the really nice things about work at Molivoti is that not only do students do the flotation work and the heavy fraction sorting work, but they also get to analyze things that using their microscopes, which you can see a student here doing. So this takes some time, right? It takes some time to learn these different seed types, to get familiar with them. So you can see some lentils over here on the right-hand side, these nice looking, perfectly carbonized, might I add, disc-shaped seeds. These are lentils that are probably about 2,300 years old. But most of our samples don't look that nice. So in the middle here, you can see another Petri dish. And this has what a typical light fraction looks like from Molivoti, where you've got wood charcoal, then you've got little carbonized seeds. I can see some grains in there, some peas, and then lots of modern rootlets and modern stuff that's kind of gotten in there too. So all that has to be sort of teased out. And then we create these categories of our different seeds. We have reference books that we consult, a reference collection that we consult. And then we bring anything that we're not sure of to the Wiener Lab at the American School in Athens, where they have a lovely lab setup and microscopes and huge reference collection. And we do even more work there. So a big part of this, especially since I'm going to be talking about foods, is what's called experimental archaeobotany. And this is by far one of my most favorite things that we do as archaeological scientists. And this is where we carry out different experiments, usually in a lab setting, so we can kind of record the different temperatures and all the different specifications. But we carry out these experiments, we try to replicate ancient cooking methods. So for example, milling and grinding grain, and then seeing like, okay, what does this ground grain look like when it's carbonized, right? Could we recognize, intentionally milled or intentionally ground grain? Yes, we can, right? Could we tell if a seed has been boiled? Let's say it was boiled into a soup or a stew. Could we identify that? Yes, we can actually identify that. So we carry out all these different types of experiments. And you can see here a student who carried out this bread carbonization experiment. So two students went to all these different bakeries in Athens, and they asked for all these different types of breads. They experimentally carbonized them, right? So they burned these pieces of bread basically to sort of replicate what ancient bread might look like that we would find in the archaeological record, and then to study its microscopic composition. So we were able to study some of those things using a scanning electron microscope at the Wiener Lab, which you see us sitting at here on the right-hand side. And then there's this, we don't have a good name for it, but there's this category of unidentified botanical material that we call food lumps, which I know is probably very off-putting. But food lumps are simply a mishmash of things, and it's not exactly clear what it might be. So as I'm going to talk about results, right, you can see I talk a lot about seeds. This is what a barley seed looks like, or a wheat seed. But that's not, people don't just eat seeds, right? They eat things like bread made from seeds. So a food lump could be something like bread, right? But it requires additional scientific analysis to see what its components or its ingredients might have actually been. Okay. So from the flotation samples that were analyzed from the House of Hermes, House of the Gorgon, and the harbor, we can see that almost half of the assemblage, so that is this right half here, are crops, right? There's nearly equal numbers of barley and wheat, as well as small amounts of millet, which is another grain. And then we also have, I want to show you little images of these plants, barley, wheat, and millet. And then we also have pulses. If you're not familiar with what a pulse is, it's basically a dried legume. So if you think of peas, chickpeas, lentils, vetch, those are all pulses. In this case, we have a lot of lentils and a lot of bitter vetch and a lot of grass pea. Then we also have quite a few orchard crops. We have a small number of olive pits, but it's mostly fig seeds and grape seeds, quite a few grape seeds, actually. And then we have these other things. So the other half of my little pie chart here is basically all wild species. So we've got wild and weedy grasses. We've got small seeded legumes like clovers, and we've got other weeds, and then we've got wetland species too, because Molivoti is located basically right on the coastline. So how do these things come onto an archaeological site, right? Well, a lot of them are either remnants of what animals were eating, like sheep, for example. The clovers are probably evidence of what sheep were eating. And then the other plants are likely to be field weeds. And in fact, there's two here that I'm going to talk about in a second. One in particular, actually, in the wild and weedy grasses, that's a little bit dangerous. And there's a reason why I think it's so prevalent in this assemblage. So the two weeds are what's called darnel, Lolium temulentum, and stinking chamomile, Anthemis cotula. The darnel is a grass. If you take a look at the grain here, on the right-hand side, right, you can see the plant. It looks very much like wheat or barley. The grain looks very much like wheat or barley, except that it's not. It's mimicking wheat and barley. In fact, when it grows in a barley field, the seeds look like barley. When it grows in a wheat field, the seeds look like wheat. It's very sneaky. And the plant itself, or the fungus that it harbors, has a toxin that can make people really sick. So in low levels, people might just get headaches. And this is something that even Theophrastus in the 4th century noted, that people would get headaches if they ate too much flour, right? That is the ground grain that contained darnel. But it can also cause things like losing your eyesight, like blindness, and almost kind of acting a little bit loopy, almost kind of like drunkenness. So and not in a pleasant way either. So people went to great pains to remove darnel seeds from their grains that they would have then ground into porridge or into flour for bread making and cakes and things. The other seed is Anthemis cotula, or stinking chamomile, which you can guess from the name stinking chamomile. It's got this really strong and unpleasant odor. So it's not necessarily dangerous in the same way that darnel is. It's just going to make your bread smell pretty unpleasant. So all these different weeds needed to be picked out and sieved out. These little Anthemis seeds, the stinking chamomile seeds, they're small enough that if you were going to sieve your grain, they would fall through a sieve, right? But the darnel seeds, because they kind of mimic the shape and size of the crop that they're growing in the fields of, they have to be hand-picked out. So somebody or multiple people spent hours every day at this site going through the sieves and picking out any of the grains that were darnel, right? And basically probably throwing them into a pit or throwing them into the fire so that there's no possibility that they would have germinated and grown. So that's probably why we see such a high percentage of darnel in the botanical assemblage, is because these were carefully selected out of the sieves and thrown away because people did not want to consume these. So that's pretty interesting. It's a weed you don't even see these days. It's been almost eradicated because it was so much of a troublemaker in the past. It was one of the weeds that people worked really, really hard to basically exterminate over the past 100 years. Okay, so at Molivoti, the primary types of wheat that were identified are free threshing wheat and emmer wheat, and then barley is present too. So we see kind of both early sort of prehistoric forms of wheat, and then wheats and barleys that have kind of like moved along the domestication train a little bit, and they no longer have these very thick husks that once contained the grains. Although the number of 5th and 4th century sites with botanical remains is very low, other archaeobotanists have noted free threshing wheat as an indicator potentially of culinary innovation. So a preference for high quality Athenian bread loaves made finely ground flour of free threshing wheat a top priority. And this is clear in Antiphanes' recollections. How could any well-bred man ever be able to leave this abode when he sees these white-bodied loaves crowding to the oven in close ranks? That's in Athenaeus. So intact whole grains of wheat and barley are actually really rare at Molivoti, while grains number in the thousands. So most of this grain fragmentation is probably part of the processes where once these grains were sort of part of the archaeological record, because the soils kind of move around over time and there's wetting and drying during the winters and summers, something as fragile as a carbonized wheat or barley grain might crack, right? But there are also possibilities of something else happening. And that's what you're seeing over here on the left-hand side of the slide. So there are several 135 grain fragments that possess a really unique morphology. And these are fragmented prior to being burned in a cooking event. So that's what you're seeing, this like heart-shaped sort of top of these grains indicates that they were broken before they were carbonized, and the interior of those grains kind of plumped up a little bit. So how might cereals have been ground, and what grain-based dishes might have been prepared? During the excavations and survey around the Molivoti Peninsula, as investigated by Tom Tartarin, who just spoke earlier, hundreds of mill artifacts were recovered. Most of these fragmentary objects have been identified as portions of Olynthus mills, which you can see here, consisting of a rectangular upper stone with a hopper for pouring in the grain, and a lower stone against it, which was moved back and forth using a handheld lever. So this is really different from other types of mills, right? So instead of a rotary quern, which is sort of moving things back, you know, in a circular motion, or earlier querns where it's sort of a back and forth motion, this one is actually just sort of a lateral motion, which is kind of interesting. One of the staple foods of classical Greece was maza, a mash of roasted barley flour mixed with water, milk, and oil. Pliny notes, the Greeks first soak barley in water and then leave it for a night to dry. And then the next day they parch it, right? There's the fire. They parch it by the fire and then grind it in the mill. The pot prop at Molivoti mentioned earlier was found associated with a near pure assemblage of ground grain, suggesting that one possible use of ceramic vessels at Molivoti, elevated above cooking fires, may have been for roasting grain. A Greek variety of breads made from ground cereals.
Chantel, I'm sorry, somehow you got muted.
Am I back? Sorry
You're
about
back.
that. Well, I don't think you probably missed much. Okay, we'll move on. So there are all sorts of different types of breads that have been found. I'll draw your attention to this plaster-lined basin here. This is from the House of the Gorgon. We weren't exactly sure what this feature might have been, but inside of it, there were 21 little food lumps, right? Which I kind of already introduced that term, which we think has a really bread-like consistency. So we investigated these using a scanning electron microscope in Athens. You can see one over here on the right-hand side. And it has this really porous texture, right, with these air bubbles. And those air bubbles could represent during the leavening process, right? Yeast is active, the yeast is excreting carbon dioxide. And it causes these air bubbles to form. Well, even in carbonized bread or food lumps or whatever, we can still see some of those pockets of air, that spongy texture. So this deserves further study, but we were also able to combine this with looking at plant cells, basically microscopic plant cells that also survived the carbonization process, where we could see little husk cells, phytoliths, from wheat and barley that were present in some of these bread samples. So it seems a good bet that they probably are actually grain-based bits of bread. Okay. At Molivoti, again in the House of de Gorgon, a deep stone-lined well has offered really incredible levels of botanical preservation. Its contents represent discarded refuse. So again, after this was not a well anymore, it became a garbage dump, placed into the well after it went out of use, and several carbonized amorphous food lumps, for lack of a better term, were excavated from here and from the harbor feature. The preliminary phytolith and starch analysis suggests that, again, these lumps are grain-based. But one really cool thing, which I haven't seen anywhere else, is if you look closely at this image from a scanning electron microscope up here, I hope you can see there's sort of like ghost-like kind of images on the surface of the food lump, right? And here's one I'm just kind of like putting the shape there so you can see it. It very much has the shape of sesame seeds. And we have yet to find any sesame seeds during these excavations, actually here in the residential deposits at Molivoti. If you think about it, right, oil seeds are very difficult to find in archaeological deposits, just because, right, with that high oil content, like flax seeds, sesame seeds, any kind of oil seed, because as soon as that oil heats up inside the seed, it just like combusts, and you know, the whole seed is kind of destroyed. So it's very possible that these sesame seeds might have coated this food lump, it might have coated this potential bread. There's many recipes that have sesame coated breads. But during the carbonization process, the sesame seeds burned off. And so it wasn't until this past summer that we actually started finding sesame seeds at the Associated Temple site. So that was a very cool discovery, because I had kind of been waiting, honestly, since 2016 to see if we might recover sesame seeds. So that was fun. Okay. An archaeobotanist whose name is Sultana Valimati, she's kind of the pioneer of recognizing and identifying cooked foods as archaeobotanical evidence. So she's noted in her work that boiled pulses, right, like the bitter vetch that you see here, can be identified by basically sort of warped halves of the seeds. So if you think about a peanut, right, a peanut is also a member of the Fabaceae family, right? A peanut kind of cracks right down the middle, so you get two kind of like little halves of the peanut. That's common for most or all, I guess, seeds of the Fabaceae family. So for things like lentils, for example, or peas, right, split pea soup, right, that's when you get this split down the middle of the seed. And it turns out when these pulse seeds like lentils and peas and things are boiled, we see damage to those halves of the seeds. So that's what you're looking at here. These are boiled halves of the seeds, right? And you can see all this interior damage. That would indicate that they've been boiled. Well, the same is true at Molivoti. Here are boiled grass peas, that's Lathyrus, the genus, from Molivoti, where we again see that kind of damage. So that's also really, really interesting, right? Because there's all sorts of references in historical sources to the boiling of lentils and the boiling of peas and the boiling of vetches as side dishes, soups, and snacks. Boiled lentils in soups were a daily staple for many in the classical world and an important source of proteins and other nutrients. The remains of orchard crops are also present in the deposits from Molivoti. Many could have been eaten fresh or dried, but the carbonized remains from the site represent only the bits of fruits that were exposed to fire, right? So there's probably a lot of things that were present at the site that just simply didn't get carbonized, especially when foods are eaten raw or fresh, right? If you think about fruits and vegetables being eaten raw and fresh, and leafy greens also being eaten fresh. So there certainly can be cooking accidents and those sorts of things, but we're probably missing things. And one of the things that was really surprising is that we really don't have many olive pits. It's one of the most common types of plant remain to find at Mediterranean sites, simply because the olive pit is so sturdy that if it does get carbonized, they tend to survive really well. And we've got very, very few olive pits from Molivoti. However, in context, right, what it seems like is that there probably was not a lot of olive production near the site. They might have been importing olive oil. In fact, they almost surely were importing olive oil, but they probably weren't producing it. The low-lying soils near the site are not great for olive production. Even today, there are not many olive orchards located near the coast. They're mostly sort of up on the plain near the mountains. And it's just very likely that they weren't actually producing olives. Then we've got lots of fig seeds, and this was a really cool find. So this is, again, is a scanning electron microscope image, SEM image, where you can see individual fig seeds embedded still in the fruit flesh. So if you ever looked inside a fig, right, there's that hollow space, and then there's all these seeds and like kind of like mushy stuff inside. That's what this is. So it was still actually, bits of the fruit were still preserved. So that was really very interesting to find. Figs are mentioned several times in Athenaeus' Learned Banqueters, where they were served as an appetizer before dinner. And figs could have been dried and consumed throughout the year. And oftentimes too, dried figs are more flavorful, oftentimes than fresh figs. So they could have been used as sweeteners in dessert cakes. Okay. And then the most notable of the orchard crops, particularly in classical northern Greece, is the grape. Wild grapes are part of the natural vegetation of this region. They're found at sites as early as the Neolithic period. So 8,000 years prior, there are grape seeds showing up, but they look a little bit different than the seeds that you're seeing here. These are two seeds that are characteristic of domesticated grape. So for one, the larger seed here on the left, it has this very sort of like elongated teardrop shape to it. That's a domesticated grape. If it was a wild grape seed, it would just have like sort of like a circular sort of globular shape to it. And then the little one next to it, this little pip here, this little like shriveled guy, the reason he's shriveled is because he never fully reached maturity. In domesticated grapes, not all of the seeds reach maturity, and they stay sort of like immature and a little bit shriveled. So again, finding these at a site is a good indicator that you've got domesticated grape too. And then speaking of amazing preservation, right, if you could think about how fragile a grape skin is in that harbor feature I mentioned, where we got that excellent botanical preservation, you can still actually see the folds of a grape skin. It's not the whole grape, right? It's kind of fragmented, but part of it is there. So this might have been a raisin, or this might have been a grape that was stomped and smashed to extract the juice to make wine. We're not really sure. Okay. Beyond the well-known and highly respected wines of this region, including those from Thasos and Maronia, both have very well-regarded wines, even in antiquity. Molivoti did have its own vineyards. There has been grape pollen that was found, archaeological grape pollen, dating to the classical period that was found on the Molivoti Peninsula. So we do know that there were vineyards near the site. But evidence for local wine production is pretty difficult to identify in the macrobotanical record that is just using the seeds. Because of course, seeds can travel with the wine, right? So finding just a few seeds doesn't necessarily mean that you've got viticulture occurring at your site. It just means that somebody's probably drinking wine. However, we also have these interesting artifacts, including this base here. This is a stone, basically base of a wine press on the left-hand side, and it was reused in a wall in the House of the Gorgon. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a very similar looking wine press. And this is from the the Ethnographic Museum in Archaeobotany, kind of just to give you an idea where you can see the same sort of spout, right? That this is kind of a traditional form associated with grape stomping. Oops, and then we can see it again here in this black figure kylix, right? So here is the trough, just like you saw, stone trough. And then here's a basket with grapes being stomped, and then the juice is flowing out of the spout and being collected here in a second basin. So that's a 6th century depiction. And within the House of Hermes, associated with the Andron, actually, a 4th century refuse deposit contains some of our only evidence for wine consumption at Molivoti. When the base of a discarded wine crater was excavated, 11 carbonized grape seeds were found inside it. Wines in antiquity were not as carefully strained of settling debris as our wines are today. So these seeds within the crater may very well represent wine dregs, which were discarded along with the broken vessel, right? So you can imagine that people are partying in the Andron, a wine crater gets broken, there's still some wine and wine residues inside of it. They decide to toss it into the courtyard. Maybe there's a small rubbish fire that occurs in that courtyard, and right, they're just trying to keep the smell of the garbage down or whatnot. And this crater base gets burned, and its contents get burned too, including those 11 grape seeds. So that was a very interesting find. It's very rare to find any kind of plant remains that can be associated directly with something like a wine crater. The only other similar evidence comes from Corinth, where Julie Hansen identified grapeseed fragments inside the toe of an amphora and also suggested the possibility of wine dregs. Okay, so I'm running really short of time. But to summarize this particular case study, I guess I'm running long because it's like my own results, right? But basically, right, in this case, the foods are reflecting not only the people who were likely consuming them, right, and this preferred, these preferred ingredients for what we would, term like traditional classical Greek cuisine. We're not seeing foods from the Rhodope Mountains to the north. We're not seeing necessarily foods that might be associated with Thracian cultures. What we see are cooking methods and cooking techniques and cooking ingredients that reflect a Greek identity. So in this case, right, although we might be curious about the identities of enslaved people who were very likely cooking these meals in these two relatively fancy homes at Molivoti, for the most part, right, they remain unidentified. And the only thing we can recognize is the incredible amount of labor that would have gone into preparing these types of foods, from stomping grapes from hours on end during, the late summer, to grinding grain, probably like every day, right? That's an activity that takes sometimes 4 or 5 hours every day, depending on who's carrying it out. Picking out all of those darnel seeds so that the brain doesn't give everybody a headache, right? So that the bread doesn't give a headache, right? So you're picking out all those individual seeds. All of this is just hours and hours of labor. And that's how we kind of can begin to see some of the people who have maybe been overlooked in our analyses of the archaeological record. So with the little time I've got left, yikes, I'm going to move to the south. I'm going to move to an interesting case study that's not my own work, although I have worked at a site, right nearby. I'm going to be talking about the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Acrocorinth in Greece, which is in the northeastern Peloponnese. All right. So according to Pausanias, there's at least 10 different sanctuaries located on the northern slope of Acrocorinth and at its base. So this mountain that you see up here is Acrocorinth. And basically where this, in this top photo here, this is Acrocorinth. And then down below, sort of just out of reach of this photo, is ancient Corinth, the archaeological site, and ancient Corinth, the modern village, where there's a whole lot of archaeological work also occurring. Only one of these sanctuaries, the one you can see in the white box, has been identified and extensively excavated, and that's the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore. Although worship of these two goddesses was widespread throughout the region, relatively few of these sanctuaries have been explored through excavation, and far fewer have had any kind of archaeobotanical work done at them. So most of this work that I'm going to mention here was carried out in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and then the only archaeobotanical work was carried out when excavators returned in 1994 to the site. And then they realized what this site was. They realized how important it would be to find evidence of the foods that were being prepared and consumed there. So they went back in 1994 and they carried out flotation. So before this, only a handful of seeds have been found. They did find animal bones in the sacrifice of piglets, but not so much in the way of plant remains. An olive pit here or there when an excavator with really good eyes saw an olive pit, right? Otherwise, nothing. So Director Nancy Boukides realized that this was a real loss of information, especially for a sanctuary that proved to have so many dining facilities. Flotation went on to occur. For the most, actually, I go back to this. For the most part, the sanctuary covers about 770 square meters. It was linked to the ancient city below by the road that passed along its lower north side. So basically a road heading down this way. There was a staircase that descended to the south. There were rows of small dining complexes, and that's what you see in the site plan here. Is 36 different dining rooms where people would have meals. The earliest dining rooms date to the 6th century BC, and they continued to be used and rebuilt until 146 BCE. They were these one-room units, lots of room for different couches and tables and things. And then some of them actually had little subsidiary rooms for kitchens and for washing and cooking and for sitting. So by 400 BCE, we've got 36 of these dining rooms. There's also areas where sacrifices occurred. This created a very different signature. Repositories for votive offerings and a square enclosure, which was likely a temple during the Archaic and Classical periods. So a lot of the archaeobotanical work focused on N21, this particular dining room, N21. You can see here where soil samples were taken. This is where the couches were, right? You can see the benches for the couches along the perimeter of the room. And then there was a small room over here with a clay floor that was likely a kitchen area. We don't have any good photos of this room, so I put these two on the right-hand side so you can kind of get a sense of what the excavations looked like in dining rooms just like this. So the archaeobotanist who carried out this work, her name is Dr. Julie Hansen. She was one of my professors at Boston University, and she set up a flotation system all the way up on Acrocorinth and processed these samples. And I'm kind of running short. I'll just quickly mention, she discovered these 5 first ones are the ones in bold: olive pits, wheat, barley, grape seeds, and fig seeds. The olive pits I put in a different color because they might not have been food. I mean, obviously the olive pits were not food, right? You don't want to eat an olive pit. But instead of signifying a food, it's possible because there is so much olive production happening around Corinth. The pits are oftentimes kind of like, they need to get used for something, right? And it turns out that they make it excellent fuel. So there's whole bakeries outside of Rome that were fueled entirely by olive pits and pressed olive fruits. So it's very possible that the reason there's so many olive pits here is because they are also being used as a fuel source for all the cooking that was happening near or in these dining rooms. The other things, right? These are the things I just talked about from Molivoti: wheat, barley, grape seeds, fig seeds. I put some sort of stew and porridge type things over here on the right-hand side, just so you kind of think about what these foods might have looked like. Yeah, very, very similar. These are the foods of classical Greece. And it turns out that whether you are located all the way up in northern Greece or so, in the more southern end of Greece in the Peloponnese, these are the same foods that are being consumed, which is pretty interesting, that these crops can survive in these different sort of environmental settings, at least to a certain degree. We see again, lentils, bitter vetch, peas. There was one pomegranate seed that was found, and then a few other individual seeds of some interesting things like capers. So let's see, am I forgetting anything else? The specimens of plant remains represented in these deposits are typical, as I said, of any of the kinds of foods you would expect to find in a household kitchen in the 5th and 4th century BCE. These findings were not sacrificial offerings. So working together with a soil micromorphologist, they did identify ash deposits that were associated with sacrifices. These same plant remains were not found there. Instead, the remains that Professor Hansen identified were the remains of people who were dining and eating these things. They were cooking these things there, and then they were spilling things, and they were basically creating refuse deposits, whether intentionally or not, very similar to the ones at Molivoti, right? A little bit of food is falling on the floor, a little bit of food falls in the fire, it gets kind of swept to the sides, right? That's why she took the samples kind of from the perimeter of the room, because that's where you kind of sweep your garbage, right? So the things that she was finding are, again, evidence of sort of just like these refuse deposits that reflect what it turns out to be is probably very similar to everyday meals. There is one additional lens that we can look at, which are these miniature offering trays. And here's where things get really interesting, because now we can see what seem to be all sorts of different types of breads and cakes, probably desserts and things, right? They have different textures to them. They have different cuts on them, different ways of preparing them. We don't have any food studies yet at Acrocorinth or at the sanctuary to see what these things might have been. There is a footnote in the one article that Nancy Boukides and Julie Hansen wrote about this dining material, and that's that there were food lumps, right? So somewhere there are actually lumps of probably breads and things that could be further studied. So that's one possibility for the future, because I'm very, very curious to know what these different breads and cakes and things might be. So just a few conclusions then. Certainly, like if you take a look at any summaries of archaeobotany in Greece, all of those summaries are focused on the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. There are very few classical Greek excavations that employ archaeobotanists to collect evidence of plant remains and food remains, really. So it would be great to have more archaeobotany on more excavations. But then also, right, beyond the seed identification, which we can see the limitations of at a site like Acrocorinth at the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore, beyond seed identification, it's important to really think about the foods themselves, how these dishes and meals and things were prepared, and what techniques we can use to identify them. So whether that's looking at things like phytoliths and microscopic plant cells, whether that's carrying out, experiments and replicating different cooking techniques, or whether that's using really high-powered microscopy, like a scanning electron microscope, to look for air bubbles and things. We need to be able to identify foods at a higher level. And then also, we need to think about results from different types of sites. I think it's completely fascinating that these ritual dining deposits are so similar to what everyday people were eating, across Greece, basically. I would have thought that there would have been all sorts of, really sort of elite foods and things, and it doesn't seem to be the case. So really, we need to collect archaeobotanical material from residential sites, industrial sites, workshop sites, as well as ritual sites. Because it isn't just about the ingredients, it's really about understanding the labor and the preparation that it would take to prepare all of these different dishes, and not just who is consuming them, but also sort of invisible people who were spending so many hours a day making these meals. So I'll leave off at that point and say thank you, and then I'll answer all of your questions. Thank you.